In the hyper-competitive gaming world, usually a game dies forever if it dies one time, but sometimes a game does the impossible and it rises from the grave. Welcome to Chaos Gaming. Today we're going to be looking at video games that died, but then they were able to come back to life. Let me know which of these you remember. Make sure you're following the page with those notifications on. Let's start off with Mortal Kombat. Yeah, this is, well, it was one of the kinds of the arcades during the early 90s, but like many arcade classics, it actually struggled to maintain relevance beyond 4 games or so. During the late 90s and early 2000s, we had crappy game after crappy game, like Mortal Kombat Special Forces, Mortal Kombat Mythologies, and then later, the infamous Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, which should have been awesome. Do you remember any of these games? A lot of them were duds, but thankfully, it all turned around in 2011 with a full reboot simply called Mortal Kombat, although most people now refer to that as MK9. This was where NetherRealm Studios took over, and they've seriously brought Mortal Kombat out of the grave. The rebooted franchise looks great, plays great, and has tons of content for both new fans and old. And it's great! It's great to have this arcade legend finally be back at the top of the fighting game charts, and I don't think Mortal Kombat's going anywhere for a long, long time. Speaking of another one that, well, it went away, but it came back. Tomb Raider. Lara Croft was one of the original icons of video gaming, but a lot of people tend to forget the insane slump that she went through during the 2000s. The first Tomb Raider game was released in 96 to critical acclaim, and Tomb Raider 2 dropped in 97, which was arguably even better. Now, throughout the next few years, there were a ton of Tomb Raider games of varying quality, but it all went to crap in 2003 with Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness. This was meant to turn Lara Croft into a more mature character with a complicated and realistic plot and retooled gameplay, but it ended up being a buggy mess with horrible gameplay. After that, nobody really wanted new Tomb Raider games. Lara Croft was pretty silent for a decade, and mainly just getting remasters of old games and maybe a random spin-off. Then, in 2013, Square Enix took Lara Croft under their wing and released the first game in the rebooted series. Tomb Raider 2013 was a complete reimagining of the character, and it was exactly what Lara needed. The new Tomb Raider series has been a huge success, and while the trilogy has come to an end, I know there is more Lara Croft around the corner for everybody. Next up is Wolfenstein. Now, Wolfenstein 3D is often considered the first true FPS game, and while the series saw a good amount of success in the 90s and early 2000s, when it fell off, it fell hard. Despite practically inventing the FPS genre as we know it, Wolfenstein just couldn't keep up with other FPS competition. Return to Castle was released in 2001. It was the last good entry in the series before it took this long hiatus. Save a spin-off or two. Activision tried to revive the series in 2009 with a game simply called Wolfenstein, but if you remember this one, you know it wasn't very good. Activision gave up the license altogether, at which point Bethesda swooped in and decided to give it one more try. They recruited Machine Games to make a reboot called Wolfenstein: The New Order, which was one of the biggest surprise hits of 2014. It had really good gameplay, gorgeous visuals, and a really good story to boot. This kicked off a new series that has definitely been on a downward trend over the last few years, but I have faith that Bethesda can pull it together for the next one. Now we're at number 7, Crash Bandicoot. Now, Crash definitely has a longer lifespan than most 90s video game mascots, but he wasn't invincible. The original Crash games for the PS1 were fun. They helped bring Sony into the gaming world. However, after the turn of the millennium, Crash seriously struggled. Some would say he crashed. The PS2 years were the age of 3D platformers, but for whatever reason, Crash just couldn't keep it up there. And then when the PS3 and Xbox 360 came around, he was pretty much dead. The series was put on the shelf in 2011, but it was later revived with a 3-game remake of the original PS1 trilogy. The Crash Insane Trilogy, it was a gamble for Activision, but it paid off. It sold over 10 million copies, and it prompted a full revival of the Crash Bandicoot IP. Since then, we've got Crash Team Racing, as well as the long-awaited Crash Bandicoot 4. At number 6, the FABLE franchise. Now, FABLE hasn't technically come back from the dead yet, but I think it's safe to say it's right around the corner. FABLE debuted in late 2004 as one of the main Xbox exclusives, and it got 2 sequels and a couple spin-offs before fading into obscurity. Now, this RPG franchise was known for its attention to detail and its complex worlds as well as its gorgeous art style. The series has died off, but it was announced not too long ago that a new entry is coming, more than a decade after Fable 3. The new game is simply titled Fable. and it will be released on the Xbox Series X and the PC within the next couple years. Despite Fable being dead for over a decade, this announcement it triggered a Twitter frenzy. Now we've reached the top 5. Sea of Thieves. Speaking of Microsoft, Sea of Thieves was supposed to be their next big thing, but it ended up being one of their biggest flops on launch day. An online open-world pirate adventure that launched in 2018, Sea of Thieves was a tremendous disappointment because there was no content. There was no real gameplay, and the abundance of technical issues, despite having been in development for 4 years, was pretty bad. A lot of people expected it to just sink into obscurity, but Microsoft stuck with it. They released updates, free ones at that, bringing the game closer to its original version, and today, it's actually one of Microsoft's biggest properties. Sea of Thieves is extremely popular. It's a really good comeback story. Speaking of good comeback stories, Doom Guy and the Doom franchise. Now, Doom is often considered the granddaddy of first-person shooters. Sure, it wasn't the first one, but it solidified what people expected from the genre. And in the mid-90s, well, it was one of the biggest PC games in the world. Like many games of its time, it did struggle to keep up with changing times, and it really fell off during the 2000s. Doom 3 was released in 2004, and it was a huge departure from the series' roots. Then, the franchise went quiet. Doom 4 was stuck in development for a decade before ID Software decided it was time to get things back on track. They found Doom 4 to be straying too far from the roots, so they took it back to basics for a full reboot. The project was simply called Doom, and it launched in 2016 to critical acclaim, and you already know, Doom is here to stay. Next up, Destiny 2. The original Destiny, it was one of the bigger disappointments in gaming history, and all of us were hoping the sequel would turn it around. It launched 4 years ago, actually. It was initially looking pretty good. It didn't take long for people to realize, though, there were things wrong. The progression, it sucked. The endgame, it sucked. There was a lack of content, and it was jam-packed with microtransactions. Then, just to make matters worse, Activision pulled the same tricks with Destiny 2 as they did with Destiny 1. They released DLC expansions and then locked base game content until people paid up, essentially forcing you to pay for the base content twice. The game kept a decent player base anyway, but it was way below expectations. And in 2019, Bungie and Activision parted ways, and Bungie decided to completely overhaul the game. It was made completely free to play, and the progression was completely changed to keep players more engaged. Today, right now, Destiny 2 has a much healthier player base, and Bungie, they have a lot of plans for the next-gen consoles. At number 2, Warframe. Speaking of looter shooters, how about one of the biggest, if not the biggest in the world right now? Following the failure of Destiny 2, a lot of people turned to Warframe, which, it boosted it like crazy. Right place, right time, launched 7 years ago, very little fanfare, reviews were mediocre, and the marketing was limited due to it being an indie game. However, as word of mouth spread, the game started gaining popularity. Then after a few big-name looter shooters disappointed people, they turned to the free-to-play alternative, Warframe. The game exploded in 2016. It's now one of the most played games on PC and console. It boasts over 50 million players by the end of 2019. Now, its success has also influenced other looter shooters to get a little more consumer-friendly with their business models. And at number 1, the game that died and literally came back with a vengeance, Rainbow Six Siege. Perhaps the biggest revival in multiplayer game history. Rainbow Six was released 6 years ago, and it was not released good. Unlike the other games in the franchise, Siege was a multiplayer PvP game with a cast of characters, each with their own unique abilities and gadgets. Now, the concept was good, but the original release build of the game was pretty lame. No content, a very bad progression system, and it all came slapped with a $60 price tag. So, Ubisoft had a flop on their hands, but they knew the project had potential. They kept with it. They dropped the price, they added lots of free updates, and over the next few years, Siege started gaining a healthy player base. Today, Siege has performed a complete 180, going from one of the biggest flops in Ubisoft's library to one of the biggest esports in the world. It is one of the most played games on both PC and consoles, and it has a gigantic esports scene. Siege isn't going anywhere, and it's a perfect example of what can be done when a game has a great idea, a passionate team, and a lot of funding. And there you have it. Those are games that rose from the grave. Let me know one game we missed that should have been on here, and I'll see you guys soon.